Welcome back. We left off and Jane had a little tumble over a cliff and woke up and told Jehu that she regrets everything and that she, doesn't want to change and wants to be a proper young lady and be with William. And Jehu's offended and his feelings are hurt and he's sad, so he leaves angry. Okay. Only 2 more chapters. Chapter 13, or A Valuable Rule. This chapter is a little bit longer than the other one, so I'll try my best to read fast. Another week went by, and it was time to harvest the oysters. The Hetty had arrived right on schedule and was anchored in the bay, waiting for her precious cargo. I was sufficiently recovered from my tumble and to take part in the activities, but the bruise on my forehead lingered, reminding me of Jehu's Scudder. Jehu had not spoken to me since he visited me at Mr. Russell's. We set out at dawn for the oyster beds. The sun shone brightly, warming our shoulders, and the bay was calm and smooth with hardly a ripple. It was low tide, and Mr. Swan had predicted. Hundreds of crusty-looking oysters were clearly visible below the waterline. "Look at them all," I said, amazed. Mr. Swan had engaged Handsome Jim and several other Indians to assist us in the harvest. We used our hands and tongs and sturdy baskets to gather the oysters. When the baskets were full, they were emptied into the canoe. Halfway through the day, I stopped to rest. I looked out at the water and marveled at the sight. Across the bay, the pioneers of the settlement and the Indians of Toke's village worked side by side, gathering oysters into baskets. Mr. Swan was watching me. "This is the best hope for the territory," he said. "Well, I suppose the oysters ought to bring in some money." "No," he said, waving at the canoes stretched across the water. "Indians and pioneers toiling together peacefully. This is the true bounty." Mr. Swan had many peculiar notions, but it seemed to me that he might be correct in this instance. By the time the horizon started to turn a kaleidoscope of red, our canoe was overflowing with oysters. I felt a rush of pride at the sight of all our hard work. I, Jane Peck, had helped in a real oyster harvest. "A good day, my dear," Mr. Swan said cheerfully. We paddled our precious cargo to where the Hetty was anchored, and I was startled to hear Jehu's voice ring out. I looked up and saw him striding back and forth, getting all the pioneers' oysters stowed away, and ordering the men about so that they could leave in good time. "Mr. Swan, what is Jehu doing up there?" Mr. Swan gave me a considering look. "He's been hired on to captain the Hetty back to San Francisco. Their captain died on the journey here." "But what about the Lady Luck?" "Captain Johnson is taking the Lady Luck over to San Francisco to sell the timber he's cleared from his claim." So Jehu was leaving. I felt so many things. It seemed cruel to allow him to think that I had any choice in the matter. I had made my choice long ago, and there was no changing it now. William was my betrothed, and Jehu wasn't. It was really quite simple. I had to make him understand that it had nothing to do with him. I knew I couldn't let him leave without saying something. What would I say, however, was a mystery. "Jehu!" I called from the canoe, but he just ignored me. "Swan, get your oysters up here. We'll leave without you," he called. "We're making the tide." "Mr. Swan," I said, "I would like to speak to Jehu. Can you help me up to the deck?" Mr. Swan looked at me, a flicker of understanding in his eyes. "Of course, my dear." Once on board, my courage fled, and all I could remember was a black, starry night and blue eyes shining down at me. I shook myself. I had to speak to him. I steadied my resolve and walked decisively up to Jehu, and then halted a step behind, his turned back. "Jehu?" I said nervously. Jehu whirled around and his face darkened at the sight of me. "That's Captain Scudder to you," he said coldly. The scar on his cheek twitched. "Jehu, please," I begged, remembering that night, that kiss. "What are you doing?" "What does it look like I'm doing? I'm captaining this boat back to San Francisco, and then I'm signing on to the next ship headed as far away as I can get, maybe even China." I held up my hands to stop his rush of words. "You must realize I was overwrought and tired. I was not myself. I never meant to kiss you." "But you did, Jane," he said in a steady voice. "You did." And oh, how I wanted to kiss him again. "Don't you see? I am spoken for," I said, frustrated and torn. "I have no choice." "You do have a choice," he shot back. "I cannot break my word," I said softly. Jehu rubbed a hand through his hair. One of the crew shouted, "We're all fitted up, Captain." I placed my hand on Jehu's arm and felt it tense beneath my touch. "Please," he cut me off. "Unless you fancy a trip to San Francisco, you best get off this boat." "When shall you return?" "What does it matter to you, Miss Peck?" he challenged, his eyes clouding over. And with that, he turned and strode across the deck. Back on the beach, I watched the Hetty sail across the smooth bay. She disappeared with the setting sun, and Jehu Scudder with her. So I have a question for you. What do you think she should do? What is best? She's already committed and engaged to William, so does that mean she has to marry him no matter what? Or if she's fallen in love with someone else, does she break that engagement and then be with Jehu? What is your opinion? Last year when I asked that question, my class was pretty half and half, so I'm curious to see what your thoughts are. Everybody, it seemed, was leaving. I watched in dismay as Mr. Swan packed a small bag. He had just informed me that he and Mr. Russell and Chief Toke were going to Astoria, a large trading post on the other side of the Columbia River in Oregon. While I was not displeased to see Mr. Russell leave, I was less happy about Mr. Swan's departure. Most of the assorted men had cleared out since the oyster harvest, and I would be all alone in the encampment. Mr. Russell needs supplies, and Toke and I have some business to attend to, Mr. Swan said reasonably. But who will protect me? Father Joseph will be just down the stream at his chapel. That was hardly reassuring. But why can't I go with you? I asked desperately. You may come with us, of course, but what if William returns when we are gone? He is due any day now, I believe. William. Of course he was right. I couldn't leave. Why don't you ask Handsome Jim to stay with you? Mr. Swan suggested. How long will you be gone? I asked, twisting my hands. 2 weeks, maybe a little longer. You're in charge, gal, Mr. Russell said with a warning glance. He scratched his head, and I swear I saw a flea jump. Don't be giving away anything on credit now, you hear. There was no help for it. I gave in to my fate. Well, Mr. Swan, seeing as you'll be in civilization, could you purchase me some fabric and some thread and a new pair of shoes? I can't promise the shoes, but I most certainly can get you fabric. Come on now, Swan, Mr. Russell said. I knew by the way he was pursing his lips that he was going to spit, and I quickly stepped to the side. Sure enough, a great gob of tobacco landed on the sand, but not on me. It seemed I had the mountain man figured out at last. Goodbye, my dear. I'm sure you'll be fine. See you in a few weeks, Mr. Swan called happily as he walked down to the waiting canoe. I couldn't help but wonder if this was how he had left his wife and children in Boston. I stared at the empty cabin. Since I was stuck, I decided I might as well take the opportunity to rid Mr. Russell's cabin of bugs and give it a proper cleaning. As Mr. Swan had suggested, I asked Handsome Jim to come and stay with me, and he readily agreed. Handsome Jim helped me haul out all the blankets. I washed them in the stream and hung them on the line to dry, far away from Mr. Russell's cow. Then I dusted all the shelves and organized the provisions. After that, I ripped off the horrible animal skin window coverings and stitched some plain curtains out of several embroidered handkerchiefs that still remained in my trunk. I swept every inch of the cabin and made Handsome Jim take down the immense rotten cougar skin and stow the stinking thing behind the cabin. I was determined to be rid of the fleas once and for all. Finally, I dragged Brandywine over the stream and proceeded to give him a bath. He whined pitifully. "You're infested with fleas, Brandywine," I said, scrubbing the dog's hide. The fleas fairly leaped off Brandywine and onto me as if trying to avoid their fate. Brandywine jumped and splashed and attempted to run away, but I chased after him and dragged him back to the water, soaking myself in the bargain. "Boston Jane like baths?" a voice said. It was Suisse, and she had a basket in her arm. I expected she wanted a trade. I let go Brandywine and took off into the brush. He took off into the brush, no doubt to find more fleas. I climbed out of the stream, pushing the wet hair out of my face. "For Boston Jane," Suisse said, passing me the basket. "For lodge." "Trade?" She pressed the basket into my arms. "Gift." I peered in. Smoked salmon and berries were nestled in the sturdy beargrass basket. The basket had an intricate design of a crane woven into it. I wondered how many hours of work it had taken to make such a lovely thing. "Oh, Suisse, thank you," I said. "Won't you come in and have some coffee?" Her eyes brightened. Suisse was very fond of coffee, although Mr. Russell had warned her to avoid any I made. She smiled and sat down at the sawbuck table, and I put water on to boil. "Do you do all of the trading for your family?" I asked to make conversation. "Women make best traders," she said, eyes flashing. "Doesn't Chief Toke mind?" She shrugged. "Toke get what Toke wants." It seemed unladylike. I knew instinctively that Miss Hepplewhite would not have approved. "Boston William don't trade." "Boston women, what do they do?" "Do?" This sounded suspiciously like something Jehu would ask. "I do many things." "Oh, sorry, it's Suisse. "I do many things. Trade, fish, paddle own canoe." Suisse ticked off her list as efficiently as Miss Hepplewhite. "Boston women are supposed to be pious and meek and modest." So pious would be religious, meek and modest would be very quiet, not braggy. I explained. All at once I remembered Papa asking if I was going to let my brain rot and tongue drop out from lack of good use. What means pious? To attend church, Father Joseph's house, I said, gesturing in the general direction of his chapel. Boston Jane, you not go to La Plate house. The Chinooks called Father Joseph La Plate, after the French word for priest, La Prete. Well, she had a point, but I had my reasons. I tried to explain in a way she would understand. Pious means believing in the spirit world. You not believe in Memelus Tillicums? I sighed in frustration. There was a moment of silence, and then Suisse asked, what means modest? To be quiet. She laughed and shook her head sharply. You not quiet. Boston Jane, you not good Boston woman. Of course I am. I clearly just needed to practice listening well. Suisse raised an eyebrow. Boston women med roof? Well, not as a general rule. Boston women have oyster beds? I stared at her steadily, drumming my fingers on the table. I suppose not. She nodded her head as if to say exactly. Boston Jane, not good Boston woman. Was Cerise right? Was I no longer a respectable young lady? I remembered Miss Hupplewhite's parting words of advice. Jane, you are entering a time of great danger and temptation. Remember this valuable rule. Never forget who you are. It is your duty to be ever a proper young lady and serve as an example that will make me and your classmates proud. I fell into an uneasy sleep that night. I was back in Philadelphia and dressed in my Chinook skirt, my hair hanging loose down my back. Familiar sights met my eyes, carriages clattering down cobblestone streets, ladies and gentlemen strolling, newsboys shouting. And then I saw Sally Biddle walking down Arch Street toward me, wearing my white velvet dress, a man on her arm, his face bowed. Why, look, she said, it's Jane Peck, back from the frontier. Strangers stopped and stared at me. And she's brought the latest fashions. I shrank away. That is, if you want to go about looking like a filthy savage. Sally Biddle burst into peals of laughter. The man at her side looked up, and I could suddenly see his face clearly, the gray eyes and beautiful teeth. William. I woke with a start. The cabin was quiet, save for the sound of the fire crackling and Handsome Jim's light snores. I groaned and pulled the pillow over my head. I was just about to drift off to sleep when I felt the weight of someone sitting gently on the bed beside me. An owl hooted outside the cabin. Get off the bed, Brandywine, I muttered crankily from under the pillow, but the weight did not move. I held my breath, and then I heard the unmistakable sound of water dripping on the floor beside my bed. Except it wasn't raining. Slowly, I peeked out from under the pillow. Mary was sitting on the edge of my bunk, dripping wet, her skin glowing a sickly, unnatural white in the moonlight pooling through the windows. Reproach glittered in her eyes, reproach and something else, something like anger. She leaned forward, and water from her hair fell on my arm into stinging drops. No! I shouted, and then she was gone. Boston Jane, Handsome Jim asked sleepily. He squinted at me from across the room. The sight of his familiar face calmed me somewhat. I had a bad dream, I whispered, staring across the bunk, about Mary, my friend who died on the voyage here. He nodded. This was something he understood. Memelus, he said. No, it's not a ghost, I said shakily. It's just a bad dream. Handsome Jim shook his head. Memelus speak in dreams. He pointed at my forehead, where there was still a small scar from my recent fall. Mary tried to kill you and take you to spirit world. Nonsense, I said. It was an accident. I tripped. Change name, he insisted. Change name now, or Memelus find you. I shook my head. I can't do that. It's the only thing I have left that reminds me of who I am. I am Miss Jane Peck of Philadelphia, and that is that. Change name now, he said stubbornly. If I change my name, I shan't even know who I am anymore. He looked at me with liquid eyes. You know, he said simply. Being haunted by an angry ghost was the very worst sort of bad luck. From the days that followed, it seemed I caught glimpses of Mary everywhere. I would come back from the outhouse in the middle of the night, and there she would be, lying on my bunk among my rumpled blankets, staring at me with her black, angry eyes. Sometimes I would be awakened by Brandywine's soft growls to see her standing by the fire, her hands held out as if to warm them. And once I thought I felt her icy fingers tangle in my curls as I brushed my hair. I took to inviting Suisse and Sudie and even Father Joseph to supper as often as possible. I was grateful for the company, and furthermore, I harbored a hope that the presence of so many people would keep Mary away. One evening, after a lovely salmon supper, we sat in front of the warm fire. It had been a good day. I had not seen Mary once. Brandywine circled the table, begging for salmon. Father Joseph was instructing Sudie and Suisse and Handsome Jim in the ways of the church. From what I had heard, he was not having much success converting any of the Indians, but he was tireless. He explained it in detail how Jesus was crucified. "Boston God is very bad," Handsome Jim said, narrowing his eyes. Suisse nodded in agreement. "Why do you say that?" Father Joseph asked, perplexed. "Boston God kills son," Handsome Jim said solemnly. "More bad than anything." I stifled a laugh. Father Joseph sighed. "I shall never be able to teach them." Suddenly, Brandywine started to growl at the door. Someone was outside, knocking. It was very late now, and I wondered who it could be. I went to the door. Mary stood in the dark shadows, staring at me with grim eyes, seaweed hanging from her hair. I squeezed my eyes shut, willing her to go away. "Ma'am?" It was Champ, the pioneer with the dreadful socks. "Hello, ma'am," he said, tipping his filthy hat. His eyes were burning red holes in his head, and he was pale. So the author is foreshadowing he's pale and his eyes are very red. So watch his behavior. "I'm afraid that Mr. Russell has gone to Astoria." "That sure smells good," Champ said meaningfully, sniffing the air. "I've been traveling all day." Traveling? Judging by the smell of whiskey on his breath, I thought it more likely that he'd been drinking all day. Even so, I couldn't very well turn away a hungry soul. I stepped aside. "Come in and I'll give you something to eat." I sat him down at the table and dished out some salmon. He ate ravenously, as if he hadn't had food in weeks. When he had finished everything on his plate, I gave him a second helping. He demolished this as well and then leaned back and belched loudly. I had learned to take such belches as a sign of appreciation. "Thank you, ma'am," he said, wiping his filthy arm across his mouth. And then he sneezed right across the table at us. I dearly wished these men knew the value of a pocket handkerchief. "You're welcome," I said, eyeing him warily, watching out for fleas. "That was mighty tasty," he said, his red eyes lingering on Suisse in a most ill-mannered way. "Yup, it surely was." I was beginning to feel most uncomfortable when, will you believe it, the man reached across the table, put his hand on Suisse's bare leg, and grinned toothily at her. Suisse recoiled. "Sir!" I shouted. Handsome Jim sprang forward. Sudie scrambled around the table into her mother's arms. Champ acted as if nothing untoward had happened. "It's mighty late. You reckon I could sleep here tonight?" "Russell always lets me sleep here when I'm passing through," he said. His eyes looked glazed and unnaturally bright. "I think you should find other sleeping quarters," I said stiffly. "Hoity-toity. All right then, ma'am. Should think you'd like better company than savages, you a lady and all." "They ain't naught but stupid savages," he said, and spat at Handsome Jim's feet. Handsome Jim stared at him stoically, but his eyes were challenging. "You are not welcome to stay, sir." Sensing trouble, Father Joseph took a step forward and glowered at the man. Even though I knew he was a man of peace, his towering frame looked imposing. I could have hugged him. "Stupid savages," Champ muttered. He got up slowly from the table and staggered out the door and into the dark night. I knelt in front of the stream and splashed cold water in my face. Then I tipped the bucket and let water rush in, wondering what to do. Wait, did something happen? Oh, it's sorry. So it shows a passing of time. The dots, I missed those. So time has passed. I was like, whoa, what happened? Okay, so Champ came, he sneezed right at them. So remember, his eyes were red, he was pale, so he was sick, and he sneezed on them. I knelt in front of the stream and splashed cold water in my face. Then I tipped the bucket and let the water rush in, wondering what to do. A week and a half after the disturbing incident with Champ, Handsome Jim had awakened burning with fever. I had bathed his forehead with cool water, but he had just thrown off his blankets and looked at me with fever-mad eyes, shouting, "Memaloose! Memaloose!" I had been nursing him for several days, and now I wasn't feeling very well myself, although my feelings had nothing to do with Handsome Jim's mysterious illness. I had spent all of the previous night staying up with him. Toward dawn, I had drifted off to sleep in a chair by the fire, only to be awakened by a cold, wet prickling on my spine. A cold, wet, all too familiar prickling. I'd opened my eyes to see Mary standing over me. There was no doubt about it. I had to face the fact that I was being haunted. How did one get rid of a ghost? There was nothing in the young lady's confidant, I knew that much. "Mademoiselle!" someone shouted. I was so startled I dropped my bucket. Father Joseph was stumbling up the path from the village, his face pale. "What's wrong?" I asked. "The Indians," he said anxiously. "They're sick." "What?" "I'm afraid they have the smallpox, mademoiselle," he said, his voice breaking. I felt the blood drain from my face. "Handsome Jim's sick. You don't think—" My voice trailed off in a whisper. He nodded grimly. "Oh, blast," I whispered. "But who gave it to them? No one's been ill." I thought back to that night Champ had visited. He had seemed odd, but his behavior had been so atrocious, I hadn't paid attention to his physical appearance. Suddenly, I knew that he'd been sick. Had he known it? Had he known it and deliberately exposed himself to the Indians? I felt the breath go out of me. "How many ill?" "3 or 4. The healthy ones have left and gone away. I've been trying to help, but—" "Have you been vaccinated?" I asked, fingering the pox scar on my arm. That's the author's way of letting us know that Jane has the vaccination for smallpox, so she's going to be okay. He nodded. In the distance, a bird shrieked. "I greatly fear there will soon be no Indians for me to convert," Father Joseph said sadly. The smallpox killed off entire tribes. It killed a ton of Native Americans. The next morning, Suisse appeared at Mr. Russell's cabin with Sudi cradled in her arms. My heart went still at the sight of the pale little girl. "Chinook, la médecine, no good," Suisse said desperately. Sudi's eyes were closed and her skin was hot to the touch. "Boston Jane, you help Sudi. Swan, he says you very good doctor." "Me? But I'm not a doctor." "Swan, he says your father very big doctor in Boston," Suisse insisted. "But I don't know anything," I protested. "Nothing that would help her." Suisse held out her child to me, her own eyes shiny bright with fever. Little bumps resembling flea bites had already begun to creep up her slender arms. I hesitated. I was fond of Suisse and Sudi, but what if I tried to nurse them and they died? A little voice inside me whispered, "Just like Mary." "Boston Jane, you help," Suisse begged. "Boston Jane." Miss Hepplewhite's words rang in my ear. "Never forget who you are." I was trapped, caught, between my past with Miss Jane Peck of Philadelphia and this other creature, Boston Jane of Shoalwater Bay. What did one do in such a situation? There had been no lessons on this, no valuable rules about nursing dying Indians. There was nothing in the young lady's confidant to help me. William would be here any day. My entire future was ahead of me. Wasn't it enough that I was already taking care of Handsome Jim? Wasn't I already putting myself at risk? Papa's voice suddenly spoke loudly in my ear. "It's dirty work helping sick people, Janie," Papa said. "But it's even dirtier work burying them." I looked into Suisse's almond eyes and held up my arms. Some more time passes. I put Suisse on a bunk and Sudi on the bunk above her. The remaining 5 bunks were soon occupied by other sick Indians who'd managed to drag themselves over to Mr. Russell's cabin and collapse on the rickety porch. As the hours passed, it seems that I cursed everyone. Champ for bringing the sickness, Mr. Swan for putting me in such a wretched situation, William Balt for abandoning me in this wilderness, even Jehu Scudder for not being here. I tried to remember Papa's advice and did what I could to make them more comfortable. Father Joseph never left my side, and as much as the priest had vexed me in the past, I was grateful to see his black robes about the tiny cabin. Suisse was the worst. Little red bumps covered her skin and even her eyes. Father Joseph and I sat next to her bunk listening to her ragged breathing. "God have mercy on her soul," he murmured, shaking his head. The green ribbon I had given her was woven into her braid. The sight of it shook me. "She is not going to die," I said firmly. "Mademoiselle," Father Joseph said carefully, "she is far gone already." "No," I said, and I grabbed Suisse's hand and clutched it hard. Her eyes were closed, her face flushed. "Suisse, you cannot give up," I begged. "Think of Sudi and your husband." I swallowed, my voice wavering, the tears suddenly thick in my eyes. "And me," I whispered. For a brief moment, she seemed to turn toward me, but her eyes did not open. And then I felt her squeeze my hand softly once. Just before midnight, Suisse slipped away quietly without a word. In the end, her formidable trading skills had been no match against that greediest of traders, death. I didn't think twice. I wiped her beautiful face and dressed her in my white velvet wedding dress. The soft fabric wrapped around the gentle curves of her body, as if it had been made for her. She would be the most beautiful woman in all of heaven, of that I was sure. Father Joseph sat with me while I sewed her body in a blanket. My hand shook with each stitch. The blanket would have to do until we could arrange a proper burial. Jane, he said finally, swallowing painfully. I tried to help her. I swear I did. Of course you did, I said. We had both been running ourselves ragged trying to keep our patients comfortable. Not Suisse, he said in a strained voice. Mary. I looked up from my sewing. Father Joseph's anguished eyes met mine. I knew I would never really know what happened that night in the cabin on the Lady Luck, but I also suddenly knew that for all his annoying qualities and his preaching, he wasn't a bad man. In his own way, he was trying to be good. He was, in the end, another soul stranded in the wilderness, disappointed and far from home and everything familiar, just like me. I tried, he said brokenly. I gripped his hand. Dear Father Joseph, I know. The next morning, 2 young men died in quick succession. I ran out of blankets and had to use tablecloths. There were now 3 bodies behind the cabin. We had just dragged the last body out of the cabin when Father Joseph swooned. Rien que des savages, pourquoi m'avoir donné aux savages? Je n'ai aucun espoir, j'en aucun espoir. Probably not saying that right, it's French. He muttered over and over, babbling in French in his delirium. I touched his forehead. It was burning. I worried, remembering Papa's warning that the vaccination was not certain proof against the pox. I put him on one of the bunks of the recently dead. I was on my own. So Father Joseph has it now too, so she's the only one. Hours passed, then days. I lost track of life. Papa's words came to me often during that dark, endless time as I brewed tea and changed sheets and bathed bodies burning with fever. His presence filled the whole cabin and I could almost smell his pipe. I missed him so desperately. Sometimes all you can do is keep a person cool and comfortable, Janie, Papa said to me. Handsome Jim seemed to be getting better and had brief moments of consciousness when he seemed almost himself, but Sudie was still very ill. She clung tenuously to life, drifting in and out of fever. I found myself bargaining with God for the little girl's survival. Let her live, I prayed. Let her live, and I shall forgive you for taking Suisse and Mary. Why was my bad luck killing all those I held dear? I tucked Sudie's clam doll into her side and wondered. It was dusk when Brandywine started barking. He was out behind the cabin, barking loud enough to wake all of creation. Brandywine, I called, walking behind the cabin. The dog was going crazy. A mountain cougar was pawing at the dead bodies. It caught sight of me and snarled. Was it going to pounce? Brandywine barked wildly and charged bravely at the cat. Brandywine! In the end, I didn't faint, as Miss Hepplewhite had suggested. I ran back into the cabin and got Mr. Russell's rifle. I had never shot a rifle in my life, but I didn't stop to think. I just pointed it in the general direction of the cougar and pulled the trigger. The blast knocked me to the ground, but when I looked up, the cougar was gone, disappeared into the dark, silky shadows of the forest. Brandywine padded over to my side with a whimper, nuzzling his nose in my hand. Oh, blast, I whispered as I realized I had a fresh problem. The cougar had managed to tear the tablecloth off of one of the bodies, and a brown hand hung limply. There was no help for it. I had to bury the bodies. The ground was soft, but in my exhausted state, each shovel of dirt proved difficult. Very soon, I could barely lift my arms. It was such numbing work. After digging the first 2 graves, I thought I should get down into one myself. Why not? This was hell on earth, and it was probably my punishment for bringing Mary out here to die, for letting them bury her in her cold sea grave. An owl hooted softly, and I looked up, shaken by that clear sound. The sun was rising, bathing the wilderness in a sea of pink light. Mist hung in the air, and sitting on a log, wearing a blue dress as the sky after a summer rain shower, was Mary. Except it wasn't the Mary who had been haunting me, not the angry, begrudging ghost of a girl. It was Mary I remembered, the girl I'd known in Philadelphia, her skin shining, her hair gleaming, her eyes bright and full of life. Something thrummed in the air, a sweetness that filled my heart. Mary, I whispered, voice trembling. She smiled at me, a glimmer of pride in her eyes, and then she got up, my girl Mary, and walked slowly into the rising mist. As her black curls disappeared into the dawn, I knew, I cannot say why, that I would not see her again, at least not for a very long time. So if we were in class, we always have a class discussion of, 1, do you think that Mary was really haunting her throughout? Or do you think it was just kind of her guilt and in her imagination? And 2, why now? Why does the angry haunting Mary suddenly shift, Now she looks like she's at peace, and she walks off into the mist. So we're to infer that she's walking off into heaven and is going to have peace. So why? What has changed right then that Mary wouldn't be haunting her anymore? So think about that. We only have one chapter left, and there's a lot that happens in that last chapter. So I'll see you next time.